Masters, which doesn't have a title still, but it's kind of fantastical reflections of the rational world in George MacDonald, Lewis Carroll and Charles Dickens, and my proposed PhD topic, which is on representations of dream research in the Victorian periodical. So basically a bit of the background to it is that in the Victorian period, as I've been looking at in my masters, there's kind of a broader questioning of the boundary between the real and the fantastical, which comes from quite a lot of areas, and particularly because it's obviously in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, there's a lot of new invention, things that previously seemed impossible suddenly becoming possible. We have things like the discovery of dinosaurs, which Stephen Prickett writes about when he says monsters more vast and variegated than the most fantastic imagination could dream of when are suddenly being found under people's very feet. The picture that's on the screen at the moment was actually taken by Lewis Carroll, and it's called The Dream, and the two kind of ghostly looking children are overlaid onto the background. And this isn't a kind of unusual thing. There were quite a few sort of attempts to create a realistic representation of the fantastic, so supernatural pictures. You have the phantasmagoria and magic lanterns kind of projecting ghosts, and that kind of brings us onto Carroll and the Dream. And Catherine Bernard on The Dream writes that in the Victorian age, dreams belonged as much to the supernatural world as to science. Interpreters were sharply divided on the question of origins. Spiritualists argued that the dreams were miraculous events that permitted communication with the supernatural world, while scientists insisted they were natural phenomena that could be assigned governing laws. We have quite a few. The foundation for most, and this is something that Jonathan Glantz points out, is associationism, which he names three particular causes for dreams, which are the residue of day impressions, the physical state of the dreamer's stomach and brain, and most importantly the associations of thought and images, which always go on in the mind, but which are more vivid and less controlled during sleep. A kind of obvious example of that is in A Christmas Carol, when Scrooge first sees the ghost of Jacob Marley and he says, "Just a blot of mustard," or a bit of undigested beef. And that obviously directly comes from associationism. And that's going on throughout the Victorian period. We have, for example, William Newham's Essays on Superstition in 1830, Macneice's The Philosophy of Sleep in 1834, and Alexander Grant's The Literature and Curiosities of Dreams in 1865. So it's something that was very much a popular subject throughout the period. One of the things that Glantz also says is that a general feature of all those studies is the analogy between dreaming and insanity. And obviously a lot of people look at Carroll's Alice books as kind of nonsense or insanity. And one of the really interesting things that Carroll writes in his diary in 1856 is this quote, query, "When we are dreaming and, as often happens, have a dim consciousness of the fact and try to wake, do we not say and do things which in waking life would be insane? May we not then sometimes define insanity as an inability to distinguish which is the waking and which is the sleeping life? For we often dream without the least suspicion of unreality. Sleep hath its own world, and it is often as lifelike as the other." Martin Gardner points out that that quote probably directly inspired this famous quote from Alice, where she claims that she doesn't want to go among mad people and is told by the Cheshire Cat that she must be mad or she wouldn't have come there, which obviously is because she is in a dream. But it's also worth pointing out that during the whole of the original Alice book, we don't know, as the reader, we don't know that she is dreaming until the point that she wakes up. And also that in a lot of Carroll's work, dreaming and imagining are an overlapping concept. It's not necessarily dreaming while you're asleep, and this is from the end of Adventures in Wonderland, where her sister is sitting on the bank after Alice has told her her dream, until she too began dreaming after a fashion, and she sat on with closed eyes and half believed herself in Wonderland, though she knew she had but to open them again and all would change to dull reality. So this basically is, in my opinion, she only can half believe herself in Wonderland because Carol really believes in the imagination of childhood as a concept that is something adults can't access. But there's another example, again, in a few years later through The Looking Glass, where it also applies to Alice. And this time, instead of falling asleep, it tells us, well, this is her speaking to her cat, how nice it would be if we could only get through into Looking Glass House. I'm sure it's got such beautiful things in it. Let's pretend there's a way of getting through into it. Let's pretend the glass has gone all soft like gauze so that we can get through. And at that point, she is able to pass through into the Looking Glass world, but this time it's by playing Let's Pretend instead of actually falling asleep. And this the ending of Through the Looking Glass confirms that she's not actually dreaming it. The chapter that this is from is actually called Waking, and this is the entire chapter. It's just this sentence in the picture. It really was a kitten after all, and we have this kind of description of Alice shaking the Red Queen, and then she's shaking the kitten, and there is nothing in that to suggest that she was ever really asleep, but that the whole thing was imagination. And this is from Sylvie and Brunner, Carol again but a lot later in 1889, although actually there were two parts of Sylvie and Brunner published a lot earlier, around the same time as Alice, but this is the only time it was published as a whole story. They were just short pieces in Aunt Judy's magazine, which was a children's periodical. And this poem starts the book. Is all our life then but a dream, seen faintly in the golden gleam athwart time's dark resistless stream? And this is all our life then but a dream is a really key concept through all of his work and through MacDonald's work as well, which we'll look at later. But this is a little bit, just slightly later in the same book. The narrator wonders, either I've been dreaming about Sylvie and this is the reality, or else I've really been with Sylvie and this is a dream. Is life itself a dream, I wonder? And this, particularly more than the question of dreaming and reality, is really openly questioning what that boundary is, whether how we distinguish between the real and the fantastic. This is again from Sylvie and Brunner, and this is an example of the way that throughout the book, Carol actually makes it intentionally very confusing for the reader to tell which parts are dream and which parts are reality. And the first line, when will it be done? If there's any chance of it in my time, I think I'll leave off reading and wait for it. That is in the real world. It's set during a train journey, well, perhaps in the 1,000 years or so. But then there's no use waiting. Let's sit down, Ogo, come and sit by me. The final line we know is in Outland, which is the fantasy realm of the book. But obviously the middle line could apply to either, and we don't ever, this happens quite a lot, and we don't ever really know which realm it belongs to. So there are quite a lot of instances where there are sections of the book where it's impossible to tell whether we're in the original world or in Outland. And this is onto MacDonald. The quote at the top, obviously not by MacDonald, "Our life is no dream, but it ought to become one, and perhaps will." He uses this to start one of the chapters in Fantas, and also to end Lilith, which are his two fantasy adult novels. The quote underneath is MacDonald writing a letter to his father in 1857, the most important part of which is when the right time comes, wakes us out of this sleep and into the new world, which is the old one. When we shall say, as one that wakes from a dream, is it then over and I live? And a lot like how this is the question of at what point is reality and dream, but for MacDonald it becomes very much a religious concept of whether the reality that we exist in is reality at all, or whether an afterlife is the true reality. So there are a lot of similarities in his use of the dream, despite that this is the beginning of Fantas, which you can see in the image is kind of half bedroom and half, it's fairyland in Fantas. So he awakes as one to the consciousness that the sea has been moaning by him for hours. He saw that the large green marble basin in which I was wont to wash, and which stood on a low pedestal with the same material in the corner of my room, was overflowing like a spring, and that a stream of clear water was running over the carpet all the length of the room. And stranger still, where this carpet, which I had myself designed to imitate a field of grass and daisies, bordered the course of the little stream, the grass blades and daisies seemed to wave in a tiny breeze that followed the water's flow. This section is actually a lot longer than this, and there's descriptions of kind of the carved ivy in his dressing table becomes real. And there's very much a sense of the fact that he may be dreaming, because it is basically just his room becoming a dream world. But it actually, unlike Carol, where we find out at the end that it has all been a dream, in Fantas we have the realisation at the end that it was all in fact real. But the difference is that MacDonald wants us to believe that the fantastical world is real, because during the course of the novel we're supposed to see that fairyland becomes a kind of analogy for an afterlife or for heaven, and there's a section of the book where the main character goes to a cottage which the woman who lives in the cottage, Nick Page describes her as one of MacDonald's grandmother god figures. There's a lot of religious symbolism. The cottage floods that symbolises the kind of the flooding of the world and the washing away of sins, and he is told that he'll be able to go back there one day. But at the end of the novel, he sleeps, seemingly sleeps throughout the fairyland, and then wakes back to reality. But the important part is that we feel like he has been sleeping, and the sleep analogy is always there. And it comes back in Lilith, which this quote is from, I watch for the hour to ring the resurrection bell and wake, there is a sleep. This is from a cemetery in the novel where the dead sleep in a row of beds to be woken by the resurrection bell. This is actually in the what we would expect to be the fantasy world. In Lilith it's described as several dimensions. And again, it slightly blurs the boundary between what we perceive as the dream and what we perceive as real. This is a question asked by the narrator of Lilith. Had I come back to myself out of a vision, or lost myself going back to one, which was the real, what I now saw or what I had just ceased to see, could both be real, interpenetrating yet unmingling. And basically in both Carol and MacDonald, the answer to that seems to be yes, it can be interpenetrating yet unmingling, it can be real and dream. And this all comes from that original, in my opinion, questioning of the boundary between what can be real, what can be imagination, from the original dream research, which was divided between the scientific and the spiritual.